Cities Skylines 2 is one of the worst optimized games we have ever tested. And normally we don't throw around the word optimized, but with this one, it's really clear. In fact, it was bad enough that the developers themselves posted multiple panicked updates ahead of launch to tell people as much. In the time since launch, we've tested about 23 GPUs at multiple graphic settings and resolutions, but we won't bother presenting anything beyond 1080p because the RTX 4090 was stuck below 40 FPS average when it was at 4K low. City builders are actually one of the main genres that I've played over the years, so I have a lot of experience dating back to Caesar 3 was the first one I ever played. I love city builder games. This one, it just has a lot of performance issues. We're going to talk about some of those today. And this testing was done using a pack of save games that were published by City Planner Plays, who's a YouTuber who really focuses on the gaming side of this. So City Planner did a good job with some of the initial benchmarks. We're here to pick up the torch for some in-depth performance and graphics analysis, where we found everything from bugged texture quality settings that almost seem inverse to the setting, all the way up to bad stutters. The game itself appears to be getting updates, so that's great to see. From what we can tell, it looks like a fun game that just needs some more time to bake. And the fact that the devs can increase performance within 2 days of launch proves that. But optimization or not, we can still talk about GPU performance, so let's get into that. Before that, this video is brought to you by Lexar Thor Memory. Lexar's new Thor DDR5 and DDR4 RAM includes a heavy-duty aluminum heat spreader while retaining a relatively low profile form factor for PCs with tighter air cooler clearance. The Lexar Thor memory supports both Expo and Intel XMP timings and is available from DDR5 5600 to DDR5 6000 CL32. Learn more at the link in the description below. There's a lot in here considering it all took place within the last couple of days for us. So quick breakdown of what this content is. We have comparative benchmarks. That means just a lot of cards against each other to help you choose which one you might want if you're buying or upgrading. We also have one-off feature tests for optimization purposes where we apply each setting individually to look at the type of impact it has if you're trying to boost the frame rate by a little bit while still keeping as much graphics quality as you can. And additionally, we have a section dedicated to the visuals of the game comparatively, looking at one preset versus the next, just with all the settings changed per the preset to see what you might be giving up by going from, say, high or medium down to low. Because the patch shipped after we'd done our testing with all of these GPUs, we went back to add in the patch. That'll give us relative percent uplift scaling from a couple of cards so that we can figure out how much it might affect all of the cards on the chart, because we're not going to redo all of them for 5%, but we can get an idea where things land. Now, with that current patch, most of these cards are still roughly in the same place that they were with the launch version of the game, which is what we did most of our testing with. So they're within about 3 to 5 FPS or so of where they were data logged originally, and that won't change in many cases. However, it is enough to help in a few specific cases, especially cards that are sort of on the edge of playability. Let's start with researching the city size for defining the methodology. We did this testing with our standard GPU test methodology and platform, but we used the City Planner Plays files for testing. So again, a massive thank you to him for posting some real gameplay save files to make testing easier. We'll link him below. If you play this game, you should check out his channel. A game like this, you can't test properly just on an empty map or a freshly started one. Most city builders, the performance degrades over time as you continue to add on to the city. So let's look into that. We were able to do like-for-like benchmarks at different city sizes, but with the same bones. The weather and time of day conditions were all the same, as was the test cores, so just the city developing was the change. And the impact here is crazy. Here's the chart. This was conducted with the patch released on October 26th, so that's the first performance patch. This chart shows the 4090 at 1080p medium settings, and the scaling is clean. At 1000 population, pretty close to a blank map, we're at 115 FPS average. That's insane as compared to our 100K population map, where we see a 62% jump if you were to demo your city and evict everyone back down to a population of 1,000. To have a game with a 62% range is uncommon. We rarely see more than a 10 to 20% swing in like-for-like testing in games. In this game, though, the longer your city is developed, the lower the frame rate will be. But the performance degradation did appear to slow and become asymptotic as we approached the 100K population. The 100K map, though, was used for our testing, as it's a heavier workload while still representing a realistic gaming scenario. We'll come back to more research after the comparison charts to show some optimization tips. We'll start with the impact from the updates. When the update launched, we were actually already filming this video, but we decided to pause the entire project to investigate the new patch. This, however, was after we tested about 23 GPUs in 3 different resolutions with several different graphics settings, amounting in over 500 test passes. So the update included some specific notes on stutters and on LOD at higher resolutions, alongside some global illumination changes. We'll talk about those later in the video. For now, though, let's start with the impact from the patch alone to baseline, just showing a small subset of GPUs for the percent scaling. In this chart, you're looking at the original passes versus the patched passes. At 1080p low, the RTX 4090 posted a 5.6% performance uplift from the patch. It's not much, and we're not at the CPU limit yet. That happens closer to 112 FPS. The RX 7800 XT posted a 4.5% improvement in average FPS. That's good, but from the perspective of our original round of tests, not much has changed. You can approximate these differences in the upcoming charts. The RTX 4060 saw an improvement of 9.8%, so that's more meaningful than the other two, and the RTX 3060 posted the most meaningful yet at 11%. That moves it from 30 FPS to 33 FPS average. It's not game-changing, but it's definitely better. The RX 6600 posted about a 15% uplift from 25 to 29 FPS, so that's a large jump percentage-wise as well. And the GTX 970 was unplayable with these settings originally and remains unplayable here. The uplift was massive as a percentage, it's almost 18%, but that just means it moved from 11.7 to 13.8 FPS average. And with the standard deviation on this specific card of about 0.4 FPS, that's a large part of that number anyway. The trend here is that, generally speaking, the worse the card did, the more uplift it got. There was more ground to gain. Even without a CPU bottleneck, though, the higher performing cards just didn't benefit as much from this patch. They weren't bound in the same way, so seeing 5% or a little bit over that isn't uncommon on the higher end. As for frame times, there was an improvement in most of the cards, not always, but generally speaking, it appears to be better. But there are still massive frame time and frame pacing issues. Now we're going to run through the original performance numbers from pre-patch, but keep the numbers we just looked at in mind to help you calibrate against the new version. So to be very clear, what's coming up is from the day one launch of the game, which is when we started testing it. It'll give you the most GPUs to look at, but you do need to keep in mind that there's about a 5 to 10% increase on average. It is mostly linear, and the worse the card did, the more uplift there is. Our first test will be for 1080p medium. For our testing, we always toggle dynamic resolution completely off because dynamism for resolution impacts testing, and it removes like-for-like comparisons. At 1080p and with the medium preset, the RX 7900 XTX sets the ceiling at about 67 FPS average. Lows are paced better here than they were at other graphics configurations, with more consistent frame time pacing. This is in alignment with the workload going up. The 4090 is tied with the 7900 XTX here. They are indistinguishable. And the RX 7900 XT trails, giving the XTX model and the 4090 about an 11% advantage. The RTX 4080 follows that. Progressing through the list, the 4070 Ti ran at 46 FPS average, where the 4080 has a 22% advantage. And remember, this is 1080p medium. These are normally numbers we'd see at much higher resolutions, or at least graphics settings. After this, the game's recommended RTX 3080 landed at 40 FPS. That's the recommended card. That's just below the 6800 XT. The low end of the chart is built up by the RTX 4060 at 23 FPS average, which could be made to work better with lower settings. We'll next look at low settings. The preset option toggles dynamic resolution scaling quality to constant. Again, we disable that for testing purposes so we have comparable data. The first thing you need to know is that the frame times of this game are completely crazy sometimes. This has gotten a little bit better with the first patch, but it's still bad. In fact, here's a look at the RX 7800 XT after the patch that helped with stutters. This is at low settings. One of these two passes had several violent stutters over 100 milliseconds, including one big spike to 322 milliseconds. That's 1/3 of a second that we're staring at the same frame. So this is a big problem still. The other pass we're showing here is more stable. The game can run smoothly, but it's not reliably smooth. The point is that 1% and 0.1% lows in the charts coming up are not an indicator of card quality this time like they normally are, because the game itself is so variable, so they're more of an indicator of the game behavior. So here are the results for 1080p low. The top of the chart is pinned to around 83 FPS average, with the 4090 and 7900 XTX at the front and closely trailed by the RTX 4080. If we were to draw a line at around 30 FPS, then the RX 6600 and everything below it falls short and would need further settings reductions. This includes the RTX 2060, the GTX 1060, and on a technicality, the RTX 3060, although 29.9 is effectively 30 FPS average, assuming you're okay with that frame rate in this game. While these cards were more playable in the lower population cities or the empty maps, they suffered greatly as the population count and the city complexity increased. Shifting focus back towards the rest of the chart, the Skylines 2 community seems to be regularly talking about VSync on Reddit. We ran it on a 4090 just to reiterate an ancient point. VSync will cap to the screen refresh rate, so on a 60Hz display, that'll be a 60 FPS maximum value. That's exactly what we got. Doing this can help eliminate frame tearing, but will introduce potential stutter problems in scenarios where frames are not ready on the flip interval. The RTX 3080 ran at 61 FPS average here. That's the card that developers have as their recommended. The GTX 970 was its minimum, and that one struggled hard. Even at 1080p low, we could barely exceed 11 FPS average. Turning depth of field completely off and setting depth of field quality to off, just for good measure, we saw an increase of about 9% to 12.8 FPS average. So percentage-wise, that's a big jump, but it doesn't really help. The 7000 series RX GPUs have some interesting behavior in this game. They're more advantaged than we often see in some other games. So the RX 6800 XT generally outperforms or more closely equates the 7800 XT, largely because it has a CU count or a compute unit count advantage. But we're seeing the 7800 XT pull ahead in these charts. The same goes for the 6950 XT and the 7900 XT. We normally see them closer together, or sometimes even flipped, depends on the resolution as well. Very low configures almost everything to a simple state of being toggled off. First off, we're becoming bound at about 110 FPS average, so everything from 104 to 112 on this chart is at least occasionally hitting other limitations than the GPU. Let's start our focus on the 970, which is definitely GPU constrained. We're seeing a result of 28 FPS average. Maximally, a depth of field toggle would gain you 2 to 3 FPS here, so that's close to that 10% number again. The lows are bad though. You're going to encounter stuttering frequently, and in particular, rapid zooms or camera movements will provoke them, especially in the test city that we're using. Because this game seems best played at 1080p, the RTX 3060 Ti is actually beaten by the 4060 Ti. If you've been around for these cards, you might recall the memory bandwidth limitations on the 4060 Ti were severely hampering it generationally, which often results in regressive performance against the 3060 Ti when resolution is increased. But back to Cities Skylines 2 at 1080p, it's ahead. AMD's newer RX 7600 is roughly tied with the 1080 Ti, so you'd be able to increase the settings quality on these cards. The 3060 is positioned similarly, as is the 2070. As for the 4060 non-Ti, that leads the closely competing RX 7600 by about 10%. The biggest thing we saw here, though, was better frame time pacing. Although not great overall, most of these cards are at least in the 30s for 0.1% lows. Our next chart looks at individual graphic settings. For purposes of that, we wanted to choose a card that was at roughly 30 FPS average when it was at baseline 1080p low. The reason we chose this set of numbers is because the gap between low and very low is gigantic. It is one of the largest gaps we've ever seen in presets this low down the stack. So we chose the GTX 1080 Ti FTW3 that we have. That meant moving from 32 FPS average on 1080p low to 72 FPS average on very low with the launch version of the game. That's massive. We normally see swings closer to 10% in games between settings. That's a good and a bad thing. The good thing is that it means there's a lot of room for players to manually tune the settings where you can make it look better than very low, but you can still get some of the performance advantages by getting away from just the low preset. So there's room there, you just need to do some tweaking of it, and that's what we're gonna help you with. We didn't do this testing for every single card because it's not necessary. What matters here is the relative scaling. So we're looking to identify how much performance can you gain by changing different settings down. Doesn't matter if you don't have a 1080 Ti. Also, if we did it for every card, it would have been like 322 combinations just for low and very low to be compared. So relative scaling it is. Here's the chart. Baseline low with dynamic resolution off, as it was for all these tests, is at the top. Toggling depth of field completely gave us a 33.6 FPS average for both variations. That's an improvement of 5.7%. On the 970, we saw closer to 10% when we tested earlier, but the frame rate was also much lower, so the impact may have been disproportionate on that card. Each entry only changes the setting listed, so depth of field remains on physical for the rest. Turning off volumetric effects got us to 35.2, a boost of about 11%. That's significant and could be a place to find a lot of extra performance. We also did a test with the Colosssal Order recommended settings that they published when the game launched. So they recommended depth of field off, volumetric off, and motion blur off. There was functionally no impact as compared to the other tests. Volumetric alone achieved similar results, so the gains didn't stack here for average, or not by much. We did get a stacking effect materializing in the Frametime pacing though. Shadow quality jaunted us in huge ways, gaining us 37% performance. We'll show you what that looks like momentarily, but this is huge. Level of detail scaling, at least for the launch day patch, boosted us 29%. As for ambient occlusion, clouds, anti-aliasing from the FXAA baseline, and texture quality on a card with sufficient VRAM, none of those really affected things much. You could leave these at low or boost them higher to increase fidelity without much loss of frame rate. Fog boosts frame rate when disabled, and since some people seem to really hate how the setting looks anyway, that's potentially a win-win. Reflections didn't do much in our test environment, but might have more impact in other specific scenarios. Global illumination was alongside volumetric as having moderate gains. Time to look at how the first patch affected the game. We reran a few of our tests to quickly check on if the scaling we saw in the last chart has changed, and that's what matters. It's the relative scaling, not just the absolute performance. Here's the chart. We reran tests for the baseline low result, for depth of field, and for global illumination. Low baseline improved to 35.6 from 31.8, and more importantly, had a big uptick in the low-end performance. We don't have the standard deviation shown here because it's across two different passes. So that's a 12% improvement in just the baseline. The original depth of field toggle was a 33.6 FPS average result, which was an uplift of 5.7% on this card from the original low baseline. The patch boosted that to 36.6, so we're only seeing a 3% uplift now from the new baseline. You can't compare the unpatched low base to the patched depth of field toggle. That doesn't make any sense. The improvement is less significant now than it was before, which suggests changes to depth of field at baseline are affecting that result. The global illumination toggle previously improved performance to 35.5 FPS average, which is an uplift of about 12% against baseline. The new result is 38.2, or an uplift of 7.3% against the new baseline. The reduced improvement again aligns with the patch's changes to global illumination. This game is performing still poorly overall, but the patch brought a huge improvement. They really should have just waited the 2 days it took to push this. Let's get into some of the graphics comparisons. So because shadow quality had some of the biggest impact on performance, we'll spend some time showing a side-by-side of the setting. This is only comparing the low option versus the toggled off option. When shadows are toggled off, you'll notice the 3/4 angle of the city lacks any shadowing at all in the trees in the lower left-hand corner. Toggling between just low and off, we have a very flat-looking image when taking those shadows away completely. They should just call this option SimCity 3000. Looking at the buildings in the city, we can also see a removal of shadows along the inside walls of the buildings. Toggling it on and off a few times, you can really see the impact of even just going to low shadow quality. But remember, on our 1080 Ti case study from baseline low, the cost was 37%. Zooming into the city makes this really apparent. The absence of shadows is clear here, so we probably don't need to point out the individual examples. The car undersides make it particularly obvious. It's also clear in the trees in the background, where toggling shadows off removes any depth or self-shadowing from the trees, leaves, and the canopies. If you're desperate for performance, you should turn this option off, but unlike other settings where there's sometimes no visual impact for a high performance cost in some games, this one does have a visual impact, and it is tied to performance impact. Now we're comparing the presets. We're going to split our benchmark course into a few scenes and cover them in order. We discovered some really interesting things during this process. For example, the textures seem broken or extremely buggy, where as the quality increases, some of the textures get a lot worse. Additionally, we couldn't find great reasons to play the game above medium settings, which we'll talk about and show you. So keep in mind that changing the presets changes every setting simultaneously. So in this section, we're not definitively looking at any one individual piece like we did with shadows, but rather just the presets. And note as well that resolution scaling once again was intentionally disabled for these tests, although normally it would be enabled as part of the presets. We made this table to show the different settings that are toggled when in different presets. And you can see this in the game menu as well under the Simple tab. Starting with a wide shot of the city, the first visible difference is the lack of fog at the very low preset. Fog quality is simply marked enabled at every other preset, and it doesn't change appearance between them. But at very low, the full screen haze is completely gone. Frustratingly, the fog gets in the way of most of the other settings we want to compare. The next most obvious change is shadows, again, with very low automatically setting shadow quality to disabled. We won't waste time rehashing that. No shadows means no shadows. At this distance, though, even the differences between quality levels with shadows enabled is unclear. Neither the draw distance nor the softness of the shadows changes visibly. So we'll check back in on that once we zoom in. Interestingly, there's a clear increase in quantity of distant trees when moving from the very low to the low presets, but no change above that. Out of the given settings, we'd suspect that trees are governed by LOD, or maybe terrain quality, but each of these settings is supposed to scale up with presets above low. The highlighted power lines between the pylons crossing the river pop in sooner at medium and high, but we haven't played much Cities Skylines, and it's unclear to us whether these highlights are even intentional. Either way, they never show up in this recording with the reduced LOD at very low, although they would if we moved closer. With a ton of qualifiers getting to the next comparison in this relatively flat city on a sunny day without any water-related disasters at this distance, at this resolution, we haven't seen a meaningful difference between low and high presets so far. There is one, but the keyword here is meaningful, so let's keep looking. Continuing to pan around the city, there are clearly visible reflections of bridges, roads, and boats on the surface of the river at the medium and high presets, but not below that. Reflections move from disabled with the very low preset to low at the low preset, but evidently the lowest tier of reflection quality doesn't include these elements, or at least not at this distance. There are definite changes related to anti-aliasing between presets though. Moving from 0 AA to FX AA by bumping the preset from very low to low dims some of the sparkling along the edges of roads and bridge wires, but the fog is also a factor. Zooming in to a single street, we can begin to see more subtle differences between the presets. We'll freeze here for a second to point out some specific changes. The shadow under this tree next to the sidewalk is slightly sharper at the medium and high presets than it is at low, and the dithered edge of the shadow of the brick building at the right becomes sharper as well. Specifically at high, the small yellow cars parked along the street cast shadows down from their side mirrors, but that's because the LOD setting erases their side mirrors at this distance. Also, the handlebars on the red motorcycle are completely erased, likely by AA, at the two highest presets. Zooming along the street, motion blur is non-existent with the very low preset, but increases in intensity from low to high. In addition to the intentional scaling of blur quality, lower FPS at higher presets is a potential factor here. The developer specifically warns that, quote, motion blur can be very visually disruptive if you have low FPS, end quote, and that's just always been true. Moving to the very end of our course, scaling and reflection quality is visible in the cars lining the street. At medium and high, the cars lining the street clearly reflect their own side mirrors, while progressively more detail is added to the reflections on the side of this red car. Bizarrely, the quality of the textures on the signs at the end of the street get progressively worse with each step up in preset quality. At very low, the green and yellow billboard is crisp and readable, but at high, it's no longer recognizable as a billboard at all. It just looks like a blurry mess. Other nearby textures suffer the same effect, like benches and leaves on the trees. We also saw this in the street textures when we were up close, the back of cars, and other objects. This seems either completely broken, as in they flipped the settings by accident, or it seems to be an issue with rendering due to load intensity elsewhere. This was captured on an RTX 4090, so VRAM is definitely not a limiting factor. And the performance got worse with the higher settings, so we know it's not a universal thing. It might just be this specific setting that's governing the texture quality in these scenarios. Overall, isolating our analysis to this specific benchmark course, this specific city, we don't see any compelling reason to pick a preset above medium, other than some reflections. Even low doesn't look much worse than high in this area. Again, we disabled resolution scaling for these comparisons, so we're not taking that into account. If you can, you probably should disable resolution scaling, because most of the time it looks completely awful. It's using an FSR 1.0 implementation, so you get a lot of flickering and sort of polka dot patterns as they pop in and out. First off, for conclusions here, we need to address something that we saw that was very wrong in some of the posts online. So I saw a couple of Reddit posts and one Steam review that claimed things such as toggling depth of field off, boosting someone's performance from 22 FPS to 122 FPS. Saw a Steam review that claimed multiples of uplift from toggling depth of field off. That's not true. That's not how that works. If someone got that kind of performance difference, it's from something else. And one of the things we noticed in testing is that the game settings, especially if you do things like minimize or you have different selections for windowed versus full screen, things like that, it will change the resolution sometimes in ways that you don't expect. It seems like a bug, or in the very least, it's just a bad way for a user interface to behave. But we did catch multiple times the game would adjust the resolution, and more likely, these types of performance increases people are talking about might be from going from, say, 4K to 1080. They just didn't notice that that changed, or something else. It absolutely was not depth of field that gained you 100 FPS. There's something else in there. So just want to set the expectation. That setting does help, yes. It doesn't help that much. We're talking like less than 10% in most cases. As for the performance impact, looking at those charts again, there's a huge swing from very low to low. So the developers have bad defaults here. They should have more even space between these. Maybe they should add another named setting between them as a preset to give players a better balance without making the game look like trash. So there's no reason they can't have something where they maybe shuffle the names. Ultra low, they add a new very low that's in between the current very low and low, so that, again, people can get something that looks a little more presentable but doesn't have the same performance hit as just using straight up low settings. There's a lot of room for tuning here. In general, the developers in front of this, they know it's a problem, so they know. They've posted. They've said as much effectively as it being unoptimized and needing some work. And the good news is that first patch did have anywhere from about 5% to, let's call it about 10 to 12% on average for uplift, with the exception being cards that were extremely low down the stack, where we had one at 15 and one at 18% uplift. Now, when your standard deviation run to run for something at 11 to 13 FPS, depending on which patch it is 0.4, that becomes a significant percentage of the total number. So it's maybe not quite as big as 18%, but either way, the patch helps more the worse the card is for performance, the more sub 30 it is. So seeing these improvements, it's a good first step. It gives us some hope that there's things they can do to optimize, and we think they can get there, especially by tweaking some of the LOD settings, the shadow settings, the textures, there's some room to play around, and then volumetrics. So lots of places they can improve. If the base game is good, that's the most important part. And now it's just a matter of getting it so that more people can play it without issues. But hopefully this gives you a starting point. If you were trying to get it to where you have a good frame rate, but it looks a little bit better than just simply putting it on very low and moving on with your day. That's it for this one. Thank you for watching as always. To support us directly for this type of content, because we had to delay our whole pipeline to add another day of testing just for the patch, and we spent several days on it already, go to store.gamersaccess.net where you can grab one of our mod mats, coaster packs, shirts, soldering and project mats, or more. And thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. We'll see you all next time.